Hi, Alex Williams of the New Stack here with Jim Whitehurst, the CEO of Red Hat. How are you?
Doing well. It's a great day.
Yes, it is a great day. And I've been talking to my friends about this interview. Thank you so much for taking the time, first of all. And came to my attention that you really started in the airline business. Before that, you were at Boston Consulting, right? But in the airline business, that's a totally commoditized market.
Indeed.
Totally commoditized. And they basically then have to offer services in many ways or efficiencies in their flights and everything else, to make airlines successful. So we've seen lots of new efficiencies in airlines, but also we see them basically kind of charging for something that basically is totally commoditized. So you end up paying, several $100s for a flight, right?
Right.
My curiosity is about the market now in the technology space and how your lessons as COO at Delta really translate into the technology space where everything is becoming so commoditized. How do you think about creating services kind of in that environment?
Well, I think a couple observations around it. First off, you really have to be focused on how you create value for your end customer. So, one quick example from Delta is, while I was there, we were the first company to put up these gate information displays at the airport. And, that looks like a nice to have, but that all started off as how do you go from having two gate agents to board a narrow body flight to one? And so you said, well, what are all the questions people ask? What are the functionality? So it's where I'm on the standby list, upgrade list, where's the plane coming in from, what's the weather? So we put all that on the gate information displays, and there was a whole downstream set of technology required to do that. In the end, we went from having 2 gate agents to 1 gate agent per narrow body departure, and that is many thousands of people in total when you start thinking about efficiency and what we could drive. So one is just technology. You can't drive it for technology's sake. It's got to be there to solve a problem. So that's number one. And number two, and this is my probably most enduring lesson, it's you have to think deeply and hard about your source of competitive advantage. Airlines, through their history, have never made money because, as you said, there's no source of defensible competitive advantage that you can see. If you look at software companies, there have only been 5 software companies that have ever generated $5 billion of revenue from enterprise, right? If there's some who've done it on the consumer side, if you look at Symantec, but only 5. It's IBM, Oracle, SAP, VMware, and Salesforce, right? There are only 5. There have been dozens of hardware companies.
Did you mention?
They've never generated $5 billion in software sales, right? So if you just say software, and I would argue that's because there aren't a lot of sources of competitive advantage in software. So really thinking hard about what they are and how you can leverage those is important. And so I obsess about that, and I make my team obsess about what makes us different, what are our sources of defensible competitive advantage.
How are you obsessing about it now?
Well, I think Red Hat has 2 kind of core sources of defensible advantage, which, by the way, is more than most companies ever have of the 5 that have done there. Because we're going from $2 billion to $5 billion, and so I think about those companies at $5 billion. One is the ecosystem around Red Hat Enterprise Linux, right? We have a massive ecosystem of certified hardware and software. So when we do OpenStack, we have a massive certified ecosystem. So that's number one. It's just the whole position we have on a core platform. And then second is, I do believe we have a capabilities-based advantage around open source. And that goes from getting involved in communities upstream and influencing direction to how we actually productize that, right? So we obsess over what is an open source product. So when we came out with OpenStack, it took us 9 months obsessing about what's the product. Now you can look and say, well, that's obvious. It's a compiled set of supported OpenStack bits. That's not the product, right? It's the certified ecosystem, the APIs. It's a whole set of things that we had to think about to talk about what's that product. And there are not a lot of companies that know how to do it. I don't just know other companies figured that out. And then there's how we actually sell it and downstream support it. So that's a capabilities-based advantage that I do think is defensible for us. So those are our 2 sources. It's the platform around RHEL, and it's the capabilities advantage around open source. And those are things that will propel us to $5 billion.
So on RHEL in particular, and then we get to open source, there's a paradox here at play, right, with containers in the mix, right? Because now you could, with the VM, the operating system had to go with it, right? And now with with containers, you don't have that issue, right? And there's a lot of companies that are able to kind of disintermediate this whole space, Docker in particular, by almost not needing the operating system whatsoever.
See, I would argue that's a false kind of promise. And what I mean by that is the functionality of the operating system is not going away. Containers just split it in half. You have a lightweight kind of kernel space, which is the host, and then all of the components of the guest within the container, all of the components of user space are in there, right? And so the reason that gets to be really important, the bash bug, the recent bash bug, the buffer overflow bug, that impacted literally every container in production. Let me say that again. That impacted every container in production. So unless you have a Linux security response team that is fixing that and pushing an update and having the capability to pull back containers, rebuild them to fix that bug and push them back out, then you really don't have a production grade container management system. So you actually make it kind of in some ways more relevant, because by splitting kernel space, which is the host, and user space, which is in the container, having that kernel space and user space work, number one, I would argue requires having core expertise in both. And then second, lifecycle managing the container is lifecycle managing the entire user space of an operating system, which is where 90% of the security vulnerabilities happen. So we would actually argue, and we strongly believe, and the reason we're investing so heavily in it, is containers make the operating system even more important than they were before. And that's why we're invested heavily in a whole series of technologies, from Kubernetes to RHEL Atomic to Docker, to be able to build a platform that can allow people to safely, securely run containers at scale.
So
if you don't have an operating system, you cannot do that.
Okay, so now moving on to the open source, question. The foundations are changing a lot of how we view open source. How do you see foundations affecting the way we think about open source?
Well, there are different types of foundations. I think a lot kind of comes down to motivation. There are foundations where there's a really interesting technology, and I'll pick OpenStack around this, where users originally were involved. It was NASA and Rackspace, and the thing got going. Others wanted to join in, but at some point you look and you say, okay, well, we need to make sure there's a governance mechanism. And so whether the Linux Foundation or OpenStack Foundation, those are foundations that kind of were ultimately built to help govern the code. You then, frankly, have what I called last year in my summit speech, the Potemkin village, the shell of that, which bluntly something like Cloud Foundry falls there. It is a vendor marketing consortium to basically talk about a set of technologies, which really are vendor technologies. There's nothing user-driven about, Garden, Warden, Diego, the components that are within that. So, foundations have become kind of a marketing tool, and there's still a role for foundations around governance of code, but you kind of really have to split the wheat from the chaff there.
Right. Okay. So that leads me kind of back to a question about containers. Actually, this is from the team. They were curious about, your view on the container ecosystem in the open source context. And do containers really belong to everyone, or is it really the central figures and leaders in the space, that's going to rally around?
Well, look, I think that containers are going to be the way most applications are developed going forward, because it is dramatically more efficient to develop those applications, and it obviously is a very efficient way to ultimately run those applications. So that's going to create a vast ecosystem of tools and innovation around that space. Again, I still come back to containers are a Linux phenomenon, and so in the same way there's a massive amount of innovation that happens on top of Linux, there'll be a massive amount of innovation that happens in and around containers. Doesn't get over the fact that you still need somebody to lifecycle manage the kernel space, which is the host, and the user space, which is inside the container. That doesn't mean there might not be hundreds of competitors and innovations and things that happen in companies that emerge to solve components of that problem. It's just I don't see that as replacing Linux. It actually augments Linux and continues to make the ecosystem more effective and more efficient.
Why do you think there is all this discussion in this open source ecosystem about making money? I mean, obviously, we live in a business economy, right? And that's the context for it. But what are the driving kind of questions you're thinking about this whole future of actually building, an open source ecosystem that actually can thrive not just for a services-oriented company like yourselves, but like other companies too? Because it seems like the models are still very early kind of in their definition.
Well, so open source will be successful whether companies make money or not, because they're going to be large, sophisticated IT users like Google, Amazon, Facebook that will be successful leveraging open source technologies. The question is, will those technologies become kind of that default choice? And that's where I do think we have a role for for-profit companies that have to do things that wouldn't happen otherwise. So the fact that there's no company really trying to commercialize a Linux desktop that has a real financial motive to do that means, as far as I know, nobody's going to Apple and saying, we need iTunes for Linux, okay? Take that as an example. Without iTunes for Linux, there are a lot of people who aren't going to use a Linux desktop because the ecosystem of applications isn't there, right? Because let's take Linux on the server side. Red Hat decided to make that a model. And because of that, we have a huge team of people who go out, and we have thousands of applications that have been ported to and they're certified for RHEL. And because of that, more people want to use Linux because everything, their hardware and software all runs on it. Without the profit motive to go do the things beyond the source code, the fact that iTunes doesn't run on Linux has nothing to do with the quality of Linux. It's because there hadn't been a commercial rationale for people to go to Apple and say, go write this, right? And how do we get them to do that? And all that other, because there's no one trying to profit from the Linux desktop directly, right? So you do need companies that profit, who can do the things that aren't directly related to code, which is open source, that can help build an ecosystem that kind of gets the whole flywheel going.
What's your sense of the health of the ecosystem in terms of trust right now between like the larger players and the smaller kind of startups and then the users out there? There's we see kind of like the evolution of ecosystems, and there's a tendency at some points for like the dominant players to start gobbling up just keeping everything to themselves, right? And then maybe they'll like just throw out the code all at once. Is there a problem, do you think, in the ecosystem right now, about the trust factor and the health factor of open source ecosystems?
Well, that's a broad question, because there is no open source ecosystem. There are actually hundreds, even thousands of ecosystems. Very, very true. And so I think it depends a lot on the various ecosystems. I actually think if you look at like the Hadoop space, that's been a really nice, vibrant one. There's clearly a good, within Apache, there's a good governance structure that keeps it together. There are many different companies who are leveraging and building around that. So that's certainly not getting kind of co-opted by any one company.
How about in the container world?
In the container world, again, I think it's pretty vibrant there, right? I mean, Red Hat has a pretty strong point of view around that in production, and I think Docker does, and there's great innovation. You have Rancher, you have Core, you had a nice ecosystem of stuff happening there. I think what I hear from customers is they actually like the fact that different people are taking different approaches to look to solve the problem. The key that I hear over and over again is just like, let's not get competing container formats, right? Let's keep right. And so I think we're working to do that with the open container process.
So that's that is a kind of that's a factor in sustaining the health of the community.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for your time. Appreciate it, and look forward to catching up again another time soon.
Yeah, very much enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.